Good morning, everyone. Bruce has volunteered to introduce this week's leading thoughts. Looks like you've got the controls already, Bruce. So I'll hand it over to you. Thanks so much for doing that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. Thanks for hosting these things. They're great. Is everything working on my end? Everyone can hear me and things are sounding okay?
hmm
Well, these three sections and leading thoughts are very comprehensive. He covers a lot of ground, and I think he's assuming that your audience has a lot of knowledge about the history of Europe and about the history of some of these personalities because he just mentions them very briefly, and I can't really go over all of them. I don't know all of them, certainly. I found out a number of things in this time. Really grateful for Steiner for bringing up all these people who I have to look up because it's learn a lot from it. But I thought I would approach his subject here, which is the transition from the old imaginative or semi-imaginative state of consciousness of the intellectual soul to the more wide awake, externally focused, physical world focused consciousness of the consciousness soul that we experience today, that transition period that took place in the late Middle Ages. I thought I'd look at that from a history of art perspective very quickly, kind of just to show exactly the same things that Steiner was talking about, except from a very different perspective in hopes that it would clarify some of the things that he's saying. So we can see this change of consciousness that takes place here in the 14th century into the 15th century in the history of art. This is Giotto. I think this is from the Arena Chapel frescoes, which show the different events in Christ's life. And you see in these kinds of frescoes, all Giotto's frescoes are like this. They're very planar. Look at these people here in the background. Can you see my mouse? I hope there's no real space there. When people occur, they're flattened into a space. You can't really tell what their relationship to this castle is. This is kind of an interesting one because there is a little bit of a background here, but it's like a flat background pasted on a flat foreground. So a very different kind of idea of space than we have today. And then Giannini in the 1400, by 1400, the space begins to become a little more three-dimensional, but still in the foreground, we have a bunch of figures. This is the birth of the Virgin. And in the background, a bunch of figures, and they're in these two different planes, but there is some attempt here in the intermediate space to represent this bed. So some kind of three-dimensionality begins to come in at this time. These are, of course, chosen examples, but I think you'd see the same kind of things if you look out through other artists at the same time. And then Filippo Lippi in 1465. This is from a description of something that is described in Acts. It's an act of Saint Stephen who's disputing in the synagogues. And this is Saint Stephen here with the halo. The main thing to notice here for us is that now the change in the depth. So there's actually a background here, a background which looks like it's a more real background. It really, you could walk out into that. And although the figures tend to be still a little bit flat, there is a little more depth even to each of these groups of figures. And so different events, different parts of this life, or not this life, this event in St. Stephen's life are shown here sequentially laid out left to right. And this was another typical thing that was done during that time, showing multiple parts of life at different parts of the same picture. But in each of those, we see there is some depth taking place here, especially here on the right. There's definitely a depth, a big change from what we saw in Giotto, where these figures would be just layered one on top of another with no sense of space at all. And till finally, Bellini, and the space now becomes by 1500, really three-dimensional, completely three-dimensional space. You could walk into it. The figures are layered one on top of the other, as we would see more or less in space. There's not really an emphasis on individuality yet in this, at least in this picture. In fact, this is St. Mark preaching in Alexandria, And you'd have to look a little bit to find St. Mark there. Mostly you find him because he's standing a little taller than the others. So we can see pretty clearly this change in consciousness that takes place from a really pictorial kind of world represented in Giotto and even in earlier painters, we could see it even more clearly, to Bellini and later on, where we start to enter into a three-dimensional world, much more focus on the world, just as Steiner says. Steiner talks about philosophy, but I thought it'd be interesting to see the same kind of transition that's taking place in another form. Well, he also talks a lot about the events of that time. And one of the key players he talks about is Joan of Arc. And I thought it would be somewhat interesting to look at two of the things that are taking place in Europe at the time of Joan of Arc, which I assume he is just assuming that his audience is going to know these things. And so I don't think American audiences understand. I certainly didn't understand all these things. So Joan of Arc relieves the city of Orleans. I can't forgive my horrible attempts to pronounce French, in 1429. So she's born in 1413, I believe. Starts to have visions when she's 13, and goes to the court of the King of France. Now, when we say the King of France, which France are we talking about? Because at that time, France is divided. There is an attempt by, when the French king dies without a male heir, the King of England tries to assert his right over France, evades France, takes large portions of France, which by 1429 are under basically English control. There's another region here around Burgundy, which is a separate dukedom, separate kingdom, but is allied with the English. And then there is the France of Joan of Arc, which she wants to reestablish as the whole of France. And, and that is this southern part. So France is very deeply divided at that time into these kingdoms. This is during the 100 Years' War, when all this fighting is going on about who is going to rule France. So the division of France is on the political side and is caused by this lack of a male heir for the French throne. But there's also stuff going on here in the papacy. And I knew about this from the study of history of art as a young student at the University of Michigan, but don't know how much people know about this in the United States. So there were two popes, actually three popes at a time. So here we have the division of Europe among these two popes, and this is 1378 to 1417. I'll break this down a little bit in a later slide, but you can see the division here. So we've got allegiance to one pope who was in Avignon, allegiance to another pope who was in Rome. Explain how this came about very briefly. And then we also have, Steiner doesn't mention, but this is also during the time of the Muslim occupancy of Spain, and that is still here down in 1429. The Moors, so to speak, have southern Spain, that they have not been expelled yet. So we have these different popes. Here's kind of the rough history of that. And I had to write this out. I apologize. I don't have this in memory. And this is the briefest overview. There's a lot going on between each of these dates. So the papacy up until 1309 has been under a lot of pressure from Philip the Fourth of France, and they finally give in 1309 and they move the papacy to Avignon, and he rules from there. But there are cardinals still in Rome, and they elect in 1378, after 70 years, and there's a whole story here about, it's not just that there are cardinals in Rome, the papacy moves back and forth a couple times and crazy stuff. And so they elect a pope in Rome, Pope Urban the Sixth, but then a majority of the popes in the same year, a majority of the cardinals in the same year regret that decision because they say they're afraid of the mobs in Rome who are not wanting the pope to go back to Avignon. They want to keep the pope in Italy, and they regret it, and they elect another Avignon pope, Clement the Seventh. This goes on then for another 25 or so years. There's a Council of Pisa that tries to resolve it all and ends up electing a third pope who rules from Alexander V, who rules from Pisa. He has very little support. But it is going to, this election from Pisa is eventually going to resolve the problem in these two councils. Steiner talks about the Council of Constance, which resolves a lot of the issues that are taking place between these. Clement IV kind of semi-steps down. There's a lot of stuff going on behind this. They elect Martin V, but then Clement VIII. So there has been another, more has been going on in Avignon since this time that I'm not trying to cover. We are now at Clement VIII, and he refuses to step down. He refuses to give way to Martin until 1429. He steps down and he recognizes Martin V as the original pope, and the schism is finally settled. So notice that date, 1429. That is the same date at which Joan of Arc is given the troops that she needs. She dons men's clothing and goes off to relieve Orleans by opening up. She does this by opening up a supply route so that Orleans is sitting against a river, and the English and their forces are around three sides of it basically, and they've blocked off the road from the river, and they open that up so that it can supply the city. And so the siege is lifted because it's now possible to continue to resupply the city. So again, in 1429. So are there these big changes that take place then throughout this time that show these changes. Let me see if I can end this. Yep. That show these changes in consciousness, both in history of art and in some of the political things. And so you can see some of the opposition that Steiner talks about to the entrance of the consciousness soul in the political events that are dividing France and the religious events that are dividing the papacy, which are taking the attention away from this change in consciousness that is starting to take place. He goes on in the last of these three sections that we read to talk about philosopher Descartes and about how consciousness at that time had reduced to the plate as exemplified to the state where as exemplified by Descartes, where he tries to reach the spiritual world and can find that only in his thinking eye. It's reduced to this very thin experience as composed to the experiences that people would have had in the past, as exemplified by Giotto and that kind of pictorial consciousness that we see in the art of those times. He also talks about Nicholas of Cusa and the Rosicrucians. Nicholas of Cusa representing learned ignorance, or with the idea of learned ignorance, which is really an interesting concept because I think it illustrates, for me at least, very clearly what Steiner is talking about the consciousness soul, that it's not intellectual thinking as much as anthroposophists tend to think that they're going to think their way into the spiritual world. That's not how it works. It is on the basis of this thinking, but then something else has to enter into that. We've talked about earlier in some of these summaries, heart thinking. And so that other kind of spiritual warmth and things has to enter into that intellectual thinking in order to then start to lead us back to the spiritual world. Nicholas of Cusa then being one of the individuals that Steiner mentions, exemplifying that. And then the other one was also very interesting to me, which is what he calls the true Rosicrucians, who have created space in their soul, implied by this kind of learned ignorance in a way, that is separate from their life in the world. So they've made a very distinct attempt, not just an attempt, but they have completely separated their life in the world, which is a normal life, no differences than anyone else's, from their inner work as Rosicrucians, where they create this space for Michael's work to continue in their own souls. And he doesn't specifically say how that happens, how they've cultivated that. But again, I think we could go back to thinking about the heart thinking, or looking at Rosicrucian work, or looking at anthroposophy, because certainly Steiner believes that anthroposophy is a continuation, a direct continuation of these Rosicrucian impulses. And when we say you look at anthroposophy, we have to remember the learned ignorance of Nicholas of Cusa and look at anthroposophy not as a system of knowledge that is intellectual knowledge, but as you could say, a system of art. So just as we saw in the artworks, this change in consciousness look at Steiner's lectures not as intellectual knowledge, but as artworks. So this is a danger I find in using AI to summarize. Even though I do this, I find it's a danger to use AI to summarize Steiner's ideas because it removes them from the context of his lecture. And his lectures are built up in very specific ways so that if you follow the lecture along, follow the ideas along without really worrying about whether you intellectually understand them, there's something that enters through those lectures in a very artistic way, in the same way we can see in the history of art. And so I think that's what we, in my opinion, that's what we should be looking for as the essence of Steiner's thinking, as the essence of Steiner's approaches to Rosicrucian. Well, that's my kind of unusual, not directly textually based summary of what I think he's trying to say here. And I hope it stimulates some thought.
Thanks so much, Bruce. It's really helpful to have that historical context and see the ways that this transition into the consciousness soul affects the art world, the political world, the religious world. Very helpful for us Americans with less European history, for sure. I don't know how many of you have ever been exposed to the work of Jean Gebser, but he also traces this shift. He would refer to it as a shift from the mythic to the mental. It doesn't exactly overlap with Steiner's understanding of the intellectual and consciousness souls, but he traces the rise of perspectival painting in a way quite similar to what you were doing for us, Bruce, as for the age of the consciousness soul, all of a sudden not only the facts of the physical world become interesting, but space itself. Um, as Steiner puts it, there was great spiritual depth in, I mean, there's a bit of a mixing of metaphors here, but Steiner refers to spiritual depth in the medieval period, the pre-modern period, but not much earthly breadth. And so Gebser really speaks to that transition as well as perspectival painting came onto the scene. Um, and there was also mention made of Chaucer by Steiner, and who died in 1400, in his Canterbury Tales as inaugurating English literature, and um, you get this eventually, not long after that, the rise of the novel, and I think that's playing a very important role in the individualization of human consciousness as well. Um, and this transition period seems to be a kind of dangerous one where Lucifer can gain um, more of a foothold because people were increasingly confused, having lost any kind of residual clairvoyance, but not yet gained this more intellectual, conceptual clarity of the physical world. Um, Steiner was describing Lucifer getting in there and uh, fanning the flames of these possible confusions, as it were, where we're not sure what's spiritual and what's physical. Um, Michael plays a role in helping us to think about the physical world and the spiritual world in the right way. Um, but I feel like while we're still right in the middle of the age of the consciousness soul, and so much more remains to be developed there, that we're in a period where there are new risks of us being not only distracted by wars, but distracted by new technologies. Um, Steiner introduces the ways that Lucifer and Ahriman, though they're opposed to each other, nonetheless collaborate. And I think about our digital environments nowadays and the ways in which, on the one hand, there are these very Ahrimanic algorithms running behind the scenes, while at the same time on the screen are these very Luciferic type delusions. I think the social media world, the deepfake world, all of this speaks to the ways in which the adversaries working at cross purposes can nonetheless collaborate to deceive us. And I feel like the combination of the algorithmic and the screen and the role that it plays in manipulating our imagination, it feels like another uh, tightening of that spiral of um, the collaboration of these beings. Um, wanted to mention that as we, and because, when you think about the art forms today, it's all internet based and people still read novels, but there's a different form of individualization that happens as we are exposed to these new digital technologies. I think that's quite more pronounced, dangerous in comparison to the novel, but maybe there's also some potential here. Um, yeah, Jeff, I see your hand.
Thanks, Bruce. That was really, really great. Been thinking about Steiner in these terms over the last several months as relates to um, his compositional technique, not just in his lectures, but in his writings, particularly Philosophy of Freedom, but all of them really. And he combines, I think, what we would call um, spiritual or religious methodology with artistic methodology with scientific methodology. And that threefoldness seems to be key to what he's trying to bring here. And so I was hoping we could sort of double click on what Matt just brought about the Lucifer Ehrman connection, because I think we can delve into this in a way that dialogically, in a way that can give rise to a more real, intimate relationship with Michael and Michael's role. Because, well, first of all, he just says at the end of the second, I think, note, um, there's this um, very specific description of the dichotomy going on between the Luciferic influence and the Ahrimanic influence. And he refers to the Luciferic influence not only as faded clairvoyance, but as a sort of picture consciousness. Um, and when I think of that, I think of shadows on the cave wall, pale reflections of a previous imagery process. Um, and then when he refers to Ahriman, he refers to the intellect and the mere intellect, I would say, or pure intellect, or intellect without the other elements that we talked quite a bit about our previous conversation. And I'm wondering if we can sort of flesh this out. What is the what is the Ahrimanic hard intellect? And I think um, yeah, I just leave these as questions at this point. What is the hard intellect? What is the picture consciousness that is um, um, sort of faded from its continuity with the spiritual world, sort of cut off from the continuity of this with the spiritual world? And what role does Michael play in in both of these um, in both of these inadequate cognitive processes? So I'd like to just ask that as a question. Hopefully we can explore that. If not, cool. I will likely to come back to it.
Yeah, I like that question very much, Jeff. Um, yeah, Karsten, what do you think?
Yeah, I've been contemplating some things that might be related to what Jeff was saying here, because I've only read these books of Steiner that this group has read together. This is my whole Steiner background, and I've struggled to understand what he means by these mythopoetic concepts: Lucifer, Ahriman, Michael. And I think this book has been very helpful in kind of fleshing out more detail what he means here. And it suddenly occurred to me that I actually knew this analysis that he's doing, but I knew it from my background, the Danish mystic Martinus that some of you know I've talked about before. Um, but he's using a very different kind of language to describe this kind of evolution. So Martinus, he has this, when he describes the living being, he describes it on the basis of what you could call a faculty psychology, where I won't go into too many details, but he thinks there are 6 basic faculties that all living beings share, but in different combinations. And that can explain our behavior and our mental attitudes towards the world. And we know these concepts that he used because he's talking about things like instinct, gravity, feeling, intelligence, intuition, and memory. So these are concepts that all people somehow know, but he gives them a particular meaning. And when he's describing, in particular, human psychology and human evolution and our path into the Christ consciousness, he's focusing his attention on feeling and intelligence and the relationship between feeling and intelligence. And so, based on this analysis, he divides human beings, and actually, he doesn't see us as fully developed human beings. He sees us as animals becoming human beings, but we won't be truly human until we enter the path of Christ consciousness through a process that he calls the Great Birth, which it's a kind of spiritual transition into another state of being that we're all heading towards. But this relationship between intelligence and feeling kind of determines our current attitude to life. And so in one group, there will be feeling dominating intelligence. And this would be kind of the Luciferic, those who are under, you could say, Luciferic influences. And each one of us, to the extent that we are under influence from these Luciferic influences, as I see it. So when feeling, which in Martinus's analysis, it's the faculty of sensibility par excellence, both towards the physical world, but also towards the spiritual world. So I think it's something like what Steiner would call the astral. He gives the name feeling to that part of our being. So it's the faculty that allow us to absorb events, patterns, and so on from the environment. Whereas about intelligence, he says that it's not an experiential faculty, but it's the faculty we use to digest our experiences. So you have 3 groups of people. Those where feeling dominates intelligence, they will have an overdeveloped interest for the spiritual and will resist challenges in the physical world. Whereas if intelligence is dominating feeling, then you have the opposite, you could say. You resist the spiritual and you have an overdeveloped interest for things of this world, as Hegel said about Kant that he had. So you have this overdeveloped interest for the physical and the material. And so you can see that people group themselves according to their interests. So if you have an overweight of feeling, you have people like artists, but also people who are engaged in different kind of religious, spiritual communities, also fanatics, people who have fantastic views of life. Whereas if you have this domination of intelligence, then you're on the other side, you're engaged in things like business, natural science, also some criminals are of that type, some hardcore criminals. And also you have, for example, philosophers he also put into that group. But of course, in each of these groups, there can be a larger or smaller imbalance. And then in between these 2 groups, you have a very small group, according to Martinus, where there's this harmonization between intelligence and feeling. So intelligence is harmonizing feeling, which on the other hand is harmonizing intelligence. So actually what it made me think is that I see this as the same kind of analysis that Steiner is making, but Steiner is using this mythopoetic language and there might be an idea to that. And I'm curious about learning how you think about why is Steiner choosing this mythopoetic language, because Steiner was well versed in science as well, so he could have chosen another kind of language to describe these things. And you could say the same about Martinus. Martinus is aware that there are spiritual beings and kind of spiritual hierarchies, but he doesn't go very deep into that. So he used these kind of everyday terms in a rather scientific manner to describe this process. So what's the gains and losses, you could say, of using either of these two languages in describing this process? That would be my question to you all.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. Thanks, Carsten.
Yeah, I have much more to say about everything that Carsten just said, but the one thing I want to hear from Brian first, but I just do want to jump in on that last bit, and that is, I don't think of this as mythopoetic language from Steiner. I think of it as psycho-spiritual science. And I think that, as you probably all know by now, that I hang a particular importance on personality, the evolution of the soul and the evolution of personality, and that the figures involved are figures that that we're called, I think, to become more intimate with as we are with each other, like human beings being intimate with each other. That there's a dialogic possibility with these beings. As Shawnee said, we need to hang out with my boys. You know, the Lucifer and Airman are can be oppositional friends in a certain way. Um, I think that's a little dangerous way to think about um, uh, sort of beings that probably are a few light cones above us in their intelligence and their scope and their perspective. But I do think it points to the crucial nature of personality as associates with as is associated with these beings, so that we're talking, so it really drills home this notion that we're dealing with a cosmos of beings, and that part of the evolution of consciousness is that they're coming, in a sense, we are and they are coming closer to each other as relates to actual fruitful or even perhaps damaging relationships. And so to think about it in terms of rather than moral or good or bad, but of healthy or unhealthy, is the way in which we really need to be thinking about how we're in relationship with the world relative to a empathic intimacy, say.
Right. Yeah. So rather than personality being as we would normally think of the evolutionary process as sort of late addition to the cosmos that somehow emerged out of a primarily material process. Actually, personality comes first, and the evolutionary process is a function of the deeds of these super personalities, as it were. And our struggle to become human requires entering into relationship with those.
Yes, and you mentioned emergence, and obviously in Michael in Steiner's description here, or maybe not obviously, but in his description, he's describing a Michaelic influence on intellect that was part of a unified cognitive array that we brought to the table, or that the universe became self-aware of itself and brought to the table, something along those lines. And the problem with some of our friends in the adjacent spaces who are thinking about complexity and this sort of thing is they describe emergence as if it came out of some sort of totality that we don't have any intimate relationship with, but the totality is more real somehow than the emergent property, even though they wish to give a um, um, phenomenological soundness or validity to the notion of personality as emergent. It sort of undermines the actual relationship with that which is universal, I would say. And
Mm.
it takes a lot of humility to pull out that that totalitarian card, I would say, and just stay with
Yeah.
the developing intimacy of relationship.
Well, I mean, there's a very strong harmonic impulse driving an understanding of human intelligence as the result of, evolutionary pressures and us being an apex predator. And, we're so smart because that allowed us to, you know, be dominant biologically rather than this Michaelic picture of the cosmic nous, the cosmic intellect, uh, maybe I could say emanating into human form and taking on human form from above down instead of from below up, as we would usually want to think of an evolutionary process. And so this is, Michael, Lucifer, Ahriman. This is a way of thinking. I like the term psycho-spiritual science. It's a picture of evolution that's not just about emergence, but about emanation as well. To use terms from Neoplatonism that John Vervaeke likes, though I'm not sure how far he really wants to take the emanation part sometimes. It's like, what do you really
Yeah,
mean by
sure.
that?
Yeah.
Michael's intellect descending into human form, or what? But I'll talk to him about that at some point, hopefully. Um, Brian, please.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to address here. So I appreciate everyone's comments so far. But yeah, I wanted to address the harmonic versus the Luciferic and then the Michael, which is kind of with Christ in the middle. And I also think that a few of these questions definitely could be answered, in my opinion, by reading the lecture cycle, Michael's Mission, which I've read a lot of times, and it's helpful to put a lot of these things in perspective. Um, but and there's also another lecture cycle called Spiritual Foundation of Morality, which I think some of you would enjoy as well, that can help with this. So I look at yeah, the harmonic. Basically, what I've been thinking about is a mindset that we need to have, or an understanding that we need to have of an objective view of ourselves, and then a subjective view of the world. And then we need to take in the spiritual content of the world. And we also need to stream out our own spiritual content to the world. And by doing that, we're working with Michael in the middle realm, which is the Christ realm, which is holding the balance between these two. And so we're sort of flipping what Ahriman and Lucifer want on its head. We're bringing our subjective, we're looking at the world as if it's ourself, and then we're looking at ourselves as if it's the world. And if we can do that, we're actually flipping the intention of these beings. And then we can go into the middle, which is more of the, I think what Steiner would say in what I've read in these lecture cycles, is kind of like you can create a feeling realm, and you can actually connect with Christ through the feeling. And this also brings up the Descartes, what we said earlier when he says, I think, therefore I am. And it's actually, Steiner would say it's supposed to be, I am, therefore I think. And it's kind of that heart thinking from the middle realm. But you could also say the middle realm is interest. So if you showed interest in others in the outer world, and you study the outer world, you try to take real interest in things. For example, we can study like artificial intelligence, like we can really try to understand it on a deeper level. So by taking interest in something like that, you're working with Christ in that middle realm. And I think the Luciferic tendency would be the world is lost to us because we don't really participate in the world. We're sort of focused on our own inner feelings. We're focused on our inner problems. And then the other side is losing ourselves in the world, which is kind of getting lost in the Ahrimanic, the settled science, and the things like that, where you sort of you might be getting like torn, from in these different ways when you get lost in the world. But then the middle ground of that again is just trying to have interest, trying to work with Christ, um, and trying to form that feeling where you are streaming out, and you're taking the spiritual content in as well from the world. And that's kind of also what he talked about with seeing the spirit in matter, seeing the spirit within other people rather than just the matter. So it's really seeing the super sensible nature of other people and of other things around you. That's kind of how we find that middle ground working with Michael. I hope that all made sense, but try to throw a lot in there at once. So thanks.
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks, Brian. Bruce.
Well, I actually think I might be building on some of the things that Brian says from a slightly different perspective, but I think it was great that Brian spoke just before me. And my attempt is really to address many of the questions that came up here, but this is really going to be a lateral thinking kind of something I want to say, because it might not seem like I'm addressing them, but I will try to. And I'm going to try to address them by saying, I think it would be helpful to think about what's going to happen in the future. So when I decided to take this lecture, I was really disappointed it was about the past, because I didn't want to talk about the past. I wanted to talk about the future. And but it was really good for me, and learned a lot from this. And so I'm grateful for it. So I'll explain how I experience the future, which I don't experience in the future. For me, this is now. This is already, what I'm going to say has already happened. And I know that's one of the first really contradictory things I'm going to seem like I'm going to say. The second thing I want to say as a prefix is to say that I'm going to use certain language for it. And this language is not the language that other people might use for it. In a certain way, I said, I'm building on what Brian said. And I think some of what Brian says comes out of the same sensibility that I'm going to speak out of, but he used quite different language than I'm going to use. Well, not quite different language, but somewhat different language. And other people might use really different language. And you might not like my language at all. I have not found anyone who likes what I'm going to say next. But this is how I experience it. So here's what has happened already for me in the future, is that we live inside each other. Let me say it from a first person perspective. The world is inside me. Everything I experience is my experience. It's crazy that people think that it's something else. It's inside me. There's no place else it can be. And what will happen, has already happened, is that everyone will realize this. And that means that Jeff, the only Jeff that there is inside me. But the only Bruce that there is inside Jeff. But the only Jeff that there is inside Kirsten. But the only Kirsten that there is inside Bruce, et cetera. It goes like this. So it gets crazy. It's absolutely crazy. You can't make any sense of it, because it gets very quickly. And you say, well, this sounds okay, because here we are, we know each other. But what about, that guy over there who's holding a Trump flag and is holding holding one of his big guns? He's inside me too. So we tend to think of my experience is people tend to think of the spiritual beings as if they are out there, and as if they are like us. And my experience is that neither of those are true. That they are inside us, or they will be inside us. I'm switching time frames now. Will be inside us. For me, they are inside me. And that they are inside each other. They live inside each other. And I don't know how to say that in words. So Steiner talks about the coming reinvigoration of the whole cosmos through the human being. And I think you can see from what I've said how this is possible. And it's what Brian was saying also about the involution, right? He's talking about the inside and the outside with experiencing the world. The whole world turns inside out. Now I'm using the perspective of the consciousness soul, speaking from consciousness soul time. From our perspective as the consciousness soul, it turns inside out because what was outside is now we recognize is inside us, and the whole world then explodes out from in that, except it's not an outward explosion, it's an inward explosion. And again, that's from the perspective of today, because from the perspective of the future, it's much more like what people describe in a near-death experience, where they're in a world where everything is at once. So I don't know if that helps, but that's the world that I live in, and I think it really is the world that we all live in. We just haven't all woken up to it yet, meaning the guy with the MI-16 or whatever that gun is.
Yeah, I really appreciate those thoughts, Bruce. Hard to accept for some maybe, but that feels right, that we live inside one another. I mean, it's very Whiteheadian process relational, so I'm totally on board with that. But it's frightening as well, because at the same time that we're becoming more and more individualized, the being of the world is being interiorized, and we're alone together, if I could put it that way, or together alone in this consciousness soul period. And this inversion, the outside becoming inside, like just as I feel like at the earlier period of the consciousness soul era, there was this emphasis on space and outward expansion and the whole colonial thing. And yeah, we're still trying to go into outer space and everything, but I feel like as the consciousness soul era proceeds, there will like this inversion that I think it begins with Kant, the sense that, oh, actually nature is just an appearance, our mind is shaping all of it. And because of the advances in materialistic technologies, we've kind of forgotten that inversion. And I feel like the next big worldview shift in cosmology is going to have a lot to do with the centrality of consciousness. I mean, we see it happening in the popular culture now, and the way that idealism and these other ideas beyond materialism are beginning to flourish. And that is in part a Luciferic temptation, but on the other hand, it's a necessary forward evolutionary movement as well. Okay, there are some hands up, and I'll share some more thoughts before we close out. I want to hand it off to Jeff and then Karsten.
Thank you. This is really, in my mind, seamless. I really loved what Bruce brought on top of Brian. And Matt's summing it up. And I want to try something sort of existentially here from a time perspective. Maybe I can channel Lorenzo here. This idea that Michael is the spirit of personality and of the time, and that being is holding the past in continuity. So the past then isn't what we think it is. First, I want to say, Bruce, I totally get what you're saying, and I completely experience the world in the opposite way. Sometimes I experience it in the way you're saying, and sometimes I and I don't believe myself in this respect. Like I believe that this is a cultural artifact or a artifact of the evolution of consciousness, or probably some combination, a dangerous combination of both. But this idea that the Luciferic once held the imaginal as a fluid process that was emerging as intellect, but then cut off into a shadow, pale reflection consciousness coming out of the past, and that Michael's role in relationship to Lucifer is for us and this is what Waldorf education's partly all about, is the idea that the imaginal is held as long as possible as a through line, such that when we confront the world in its extremely temporal, perceptual object consciousness that we have an answer to harmonic picture of everything being frozen in time. So I was in reading this time, I really came across this feeling that Lucifer is trying to make eternal that which is temporal. It needs to be temporal, needs to be soulful, temporal experience, tearing through and negotiating this life in the best way possible as we gain traction as developing personalities. And then Ahriman wants to take that which is temporal, our sensory, momentary process in place, and make that eternal. And so I can't help but think that's a really good description of transhumanism, the latter one. And I can't help but think now, then I reflect on this, and it's a little bit daunting that comes up for me. And I'm reflecting and meditating on this amazing lecture series, The Riddle of Humanity. And in this, he describes that basically our imagination, the Luciferic, Michaelic imagination, when we come into this life as a new birth, that by the time we're born and formed, that all of the imagination that we will ever have already been had, and that they exist as pure potential in a threefold will impulse process. The potential of the spirit self, the potential of the life spirit, and the potential of the spirit man or the Atma. And um, and so here's where I see the future, Bruce, is that the future is in potential. And that what he says also in this lecture series is that that potential is what is writing the story for the next life, because it's all mostly unconscious in the will or supra-conscious in the will as pure seed potential seeking to unfold. And then this goes back to the artistic process, because what we need to do then is awaken as much as possible the interface between our life processes and this physical body that sort of that Ahriman clearly has hold of, clearly has a icy grip over. And the temptation, of course, is to say, well, there is no real self. This is just Luciferic um, 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 woo-woo. And what we need to do is technologize ourselves to the degree that we then become the permanent people that we wish to be, right? And what he says in Riddles of Humanity is basically that to engage in the spirit self is to wish without regret. To engage in the life spirit is to wish um, to figure out how to wish to do better without regret. The life spirit is to figure out how to do better, and the spirit man or Atma is the actual deed of doing and being better. And I find this confluence then, the Christ lives in the future in the will, uh, and it's Michael that's bringing to the doorstep our relationship with an unfolding will that is the future that we will be. Thank you, Bruce. I didn't know if I got that home.
Yeah, well said. Karsten, please.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to be brief to give you a little time, Matt. So um, I think this is a good continuation of what has been said so far, but Martinus, he has this concept, he calls it cosmic chemistry. And cosmic chemistry is how we play around as individuals and collectively with all these influences in our life. And so very often when you talk about Lucifer and Ahriman, we talk about temptations, but I also think we might need to see them as positive influences. And some has mentioned that, like Shona calling them our friends and so on. So just to give a brief example from my own life, I had this spiritual awakening when I was 25. For the next 10 years, I immersed myself in both my new spiritual capacities for experience, you could say, but also all kinds of literature. And some were good and some were bad, but I kind of immersed myself in the whole spiritual domain and didn't think much about the physical. But after 10 years, I suddenly felt this need to go in another direction. So I went to university and got a degree in as an engineer in natural science and spent 1.5 years studying the theory of relativity, for example. And after that, I went on being a researcher for a while, developing artificial intelligence used in medicine for diagnosis. And I think I went in the, you could say I went in the Ahrimanic direction, but I needed to go in that direction to become a more balanced person. And so this is also something that Martinus describes, how if you have this unbalance between intelligence and feeling, if you have too much feeling, mathematics is the cure in a sense. Natural science is the cure that can make you a more balanced human being. And the same, if intelligence is dominating and you get this kind of dry sense of the world and you suffer from that, you need to put yourself in places where you become challenged as a person in order to develop your sensibilities. So I think also we should look not just as these Ahrimanic and Luciferic influences as temptations, but also as forces we can use productively to become more balanced as human beings.
Yeah. Thanks, Karsten. Hmm. Well, I'm still thinking about how Ahriman and Lucifer are collaborating um, today, and I think of um, this movement that's known as effective altruism. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but maybe you know who Sam Bankman-Fried is, this cryptocurrency guy who made a bunch of money, and ostensibly it was for charity, but effective altruists are basically utilitarianism 2.0. And the idea is reduce morality to some type of a calculus so that we remove any sentimental feeling and instead, for an effective altruist, and they tend to be tech people, almost on the spectrum and very very intelligent people, and the idea is what's most ethical to do would be to uh, maximize the number of people that might exist in the future. So instead of ethics being rooted in our sense of feeling and connection to our fellows, we should always be looking at metrics and doing impact studies and a cost-benefit analysis uh, to rank what might best improve in a quantitative way, the number of human beings living in the future. But a lot of these effective altruists have gone so far outside of the heart space that even the idea of making room in the future for more human beings is beside the point. It's, well, what's the next form of intelligence that will replace us, and how can we best create the on-ramp for that? And it starts to get really transhuman. Um, and so you can see the focus on the future, the focus on a quantitative, calculative form of morality as this harmonic form of intellect that totally is divorced from the heart, which is really the organ of moral perception. Um, and then on the other hand, you've got this Luciferic thing happening in our contemporary culture where we talked about this last time. There are lots of conversions occurring to Christianity and often to Orthodox Christianity. And I think I'm very interested in this phenomenon and I'm tracking it closely, but also I wonder to what extent it's a desire to return to a past way of relating to religion, looking for some source of um, solace in a meaningless world. So let's just go back to when we used to have a grounded sense of, more traditional belief systems. And that's, Steiner was very anti-religion when you read some of his early work. And I think that's not the path of freedom. That's the path uh, to imagining that these cosmic beings are out there waiting to take care of us instead of us having to exercise our own will and discover them in our own will. Come into relationship to them freely and not in a relationship of dependence. And so I think both in this upsurge in conversions to Orthodox forms of religion, as well as in the temptation to imagine that we can reduce moral decision making to something an algorithm could do better than us. We see the adversaries trying to deceive us. And just, I think, Bruce, I really love the way you framed it. Though you were worried you might turn us off, this idea that we all exist inside of each other, we live inside one another. I think that's the right image, the right feeling to avoid these temptations, either to retreat to the past or to rush ahead into some technologized future where we can just calculate our way to the good. So really lovely conversation today. Thank you all. Happy New Year. 2025 is off to some kind of a start. It's going to be quite a year, and I'm grateful for your companionship, and glad we're doing this together. All right. If anyone wants to introduce next week, please do shoot me an email or reach out, and be happy to have you lead us. Thanks, Bruce, for what you shared today. And
Happy New Year, everyone.
yeah, see you all next week.
Happy New Year. Thank you.